On a quiet Saturday afternoon in October 1964, inside one of New York City's most exclusive Fifth Avenue stores, a wealthy white man made a decision that would destroy his life. He chose to humiliate two black women in public, not quietly, not subtly, but loudly and deliberately, as if the entire store needed to be reminded who he believed did and did not belong there. He didn't lower his voice. He raised it. He screamed at them in front of strangers. He called them animals. He stripped them of dignity with every word. He told them they didn't belong in a place meant for people like him. And as his voice echoed through the boutique, the room went silent. People stared, some shocked, some uncomfortable, some pretending not to see what was happening, but no one stepped in. No one told him to stop. No one defended the two women standing there, absorbing the hate with their heads held high. What that man didn't know, what no one in that store understood in that moment, was that the two women he was degrading were the wife and daughter of Bumpy Johnson, the most feared and respected man in Harlem. And within 72 hours, that wealthy man would lose everything he had spent his entire life building: his money, his power, his reputation, his place in New York society. This isn't a story about revenge. This is a story about power, about respect, and about what happened when Harlem answered racism in 1964. October 1964. New York City was changing on paper. The Civil Rights Act had been signed just 3 months earlier. Laws now said black Americans could shop, eat, live, and exist in spaces that had been closed to them for generations. Headlines talked about progress. Politicians spoke about equality, but on the streets of Manhattan, especially in places built for wealth and whiteness, the tension was thick enough to feel. The law had changed, but people hadn't. Fifth Avenue was the perfect example of that contradiction. Officially, the doors were open to everyone now. Unofficially, black customers were still watched more closely, served more slowly, and made to feel like guests who could be asked to leave at any moment. There were no longer signs saying whites only. Instead, there were cold stares, tight smiles, and an unspoken message that said you may enter, but you don't belong. On that Saturday afternoon, Mae Johnson and her daughter Ruthie walked into that world with quiet dignity. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't demand attention. They moved with confidence, with calm, with the kind of grace that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Mae was dressed in a tailored navy suit, pearls at her ears and neck. Ruthie wore an elegant light-colored dress, gloves on her hands, hair perfectly styled. They looked like women who belonged anywhere they chose to stand. In 1964 New York, appearance mattered more than most people admit. How you dressed determined how you were treated, especially if you were black. Clothes weren't just fashion, they were armor, a statement that said you had money, education, status, and self-respect. Mae and Ruthie understood that world well. They had been navigating it for years, moving through spaces that were polite on the surface but hostile underneath. They spoke softly, they examined fabrics. They asked questions the way experienced shoppers do, calm, measured, cultured. They weren't trying to prove anything. They weren't trying to challenge anyone. They were simply shopping. But in October 1964, in a city still learning how to pretend racism was over, that alone was enough to make certain people uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous. Charles Whitfield. Peyton III was the kind of man New York was built to protect in 1964. Old money, old power, old assumptions about who mattered and who didn't. He hadn't earned his position by talent or vision alone. He inherited it, and then expanded it through connections, banks, private clubs, and a system designed to reward men exactly like him. To Peyton, Manhattan wasn't just a city. It was his territory. Men like Peyton moved through the world expecting deference without ever asking for it. Doors opened when they approached. Clerks hurried when they spoke. Waiters smiled wider. Bankers returned calls faster. He was used to being obeyed, used to his presence setting the rules of a room. And when you live your entire life that way, the smallest disruption feels like an insult. Peyton didn't walk into that Fifth Avenue store expecting to see equality in action. He expected familiarity, comfort, confirmation that the world still looked the way it always had for him. White faces, white money, white control. So when he saw two black women standing comfortably in the evening wear section, being assisted by a white sales clerk, something inside him snapped. To Peyton, this wasn't shopping. It was an invasion, a violation of an order he believed was natural, correct, and permanent. In his mind, that store wasn't just selling dresses, it was selling status. And status to men like Peyton was something black people were never meant to touch, no matter what laws had been signed in Washington. The Civil Rights Act hadn't reached Peyton's sense of entitlement. It hadn't entered his understanding of power. He didn't see those women as customers. He saw them as a challenge, a reminder that the world was shifting without his permission. And powerful men like Peyton had never handled change well, especially when it came wrapped in dignity, confidence, and refusal to be invisible. He didn't pause to think. He didn't weigh consequences, because men like him rarely had to. For decades, public humiliation had been a weapon he could use freely. A raised voice, a cruel word, a reminder of place was usually enough to restore the order he preferred. What Peyton didn't understand in that moment was that October 1964 was not the same world he had grown up ruling, and the people he chose to confront were no longer alone. The moment Peyton opened his mouth, the temperature in the store changed. His voice cut through the boutique like a blade, loud, sharp, filled with venom. He didn't speak to the women as customers or even as people. He spoke to them as if they were something that had offended him simply by existing in his line of sight. Every word was meant to humiliate, to shrink, to remind them that he believed they were out of place. Heads turned instantly. Shoppers froze mid-step. Sales clerks stopped moving. The air filled with shock and discomfort. Peyton wasn't just angry. He was theatrical, projecting his rage so the entire store could hear it, as if witnesses would validate his authority, as if public cruelty would restore the order he believed was slipping away. The women said nothing. May Johnson stood perfectly still, her posture straight, her expression controlled. Ruthie remained beside her, hands tight at her sides, absorbing words no human being should ever have to endure. Their silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint, the kind learned from years of knowing that responding could make things worse. Around them, white customers watched. Some looked away, some stared openly. A few shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. No one intervened. No one told the man to lower his voice. No one reminded him of the law. No one reminded him of decency. No one stepped in. Not one voice said, "Stop." Then Peyton crossed another line. He reached out and snatched a dress Ruthie had been examining. Expensive, silk, imported. With a violent flick of his wrist, he threw it onto the floor, declaring it ruined simply because a black woman had touched it, as if dignity could be contaminated, as if humanity itself could be spoiled by contact. The sound of fabric hitting the floor echoed louder than his shouting. It was the moment when shock turned to horror, when even those who shared his views realized he had gone too far. Still, the silence held. No hero emerged. No customer found courage. The room remained frozen. Finally, May Johnson reached for her daughter's hand. Not quickly, not dramatically. She didn't rush. She didn't lower her head. She turned with calm precision and began walking toward the door. Ruthie followed, tears visible now, but her steps steady, their dignity intact despite everything thrown at them. Peyton followed them, still shouting, still unloading his hatred as they moved away. His words chased them through the store, out the door, and onto the sidewalk, where Fifth Avenue continued as if nothing had happened. But inside that boutique, something had broken, and none of the people who stood silent would ever forget the sound of that moment. The ride back to Harlem was quiet. Too quiet. The city passed by the windows, but neither woman spoke. By the time they reached the office above 125th Street, Ruthie was barely holding herself together. This was the place where her father conducted business, where men who thought they were powerful learned very quickly that they weren't. But that afternoon, it wasn't business that walked through the door. It was pain. Inside the office, Bumpy Johnson looked up and knew immediately something was wrong. He didn't ask about shopping bags. He didn't ask how their day went. He looked at his daughter's face, her shaking hands, the tears she was trying to hide, and before anyone said a word, he understood that someone had crossed a line. Ruthie broke first. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Not loud, not dramatic, just raw. She told him about the man in the store, about the way he screamed, the way people stared, the way no one helped, and then she said the words that changed the air in the room completely. "Daddy." He called us animals. Bumpy didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He sat still, listening. His face showed nothing. No anger, no shock, just a tightening around the eyes, the kind of stillness that made people who knew him uneasy, because Bumpy Johnson angry was dangerous. But Bumpy Johnson silent was something else entirely. When Ruthie finished, May tried to soften it, tried to explain it away as just another ugly moment, something black women had learned to endure, but Bumpy didn't respond to that either. He leaned back slightly, hands folded, eyes distant, processing, calculating. Then he spoke. Quietly, almost gently. Go home. Take care of Ruthie. Rest. And after a brief pause, he added the words that made the room feel cold. I'll handle it. There was no threat in his voice, no promise of violence, just certainty. And everyone in that room understood what it meant, because when Bumpy Johnson went quiet, people usually didn't recover. Bumpy Johnson didn't storm out into the night. He didn't send threats. He didn't raise a hand. Instead, he sat at his desk above 125th Street and began making phone calls. Quiet ones, measured ones, calls that sounded ordinary to anyone listening, but each one was a pressure point, a lever, a thread connected to the man who thought he was untouchable. The first pressure came through money. Banks that financed Peaton's projects suddenly started asking questions, routine questions on the surface, but questions that made lenders nervous. Loans were reviewed, risk was reassessed, reputations were weighed. In 1964, banks didn't like surprises, and they liked public racism even less after the Civil Rights Act. Peaton's name became a liability instead of an asset. Then came the partners, men who had invested alongside Peaton, men who didn't necessarily care about morality, but cared deeply about perception. They heard whispers of protests, of bad press, of banks growing cautious, and one by one they began stepping back, creating distance, asking for reassurances Peaton couldn't give. A powerful man without confident allies stops being powerful very quickly. The story didn't stay quiet for long. Newspapers began printing what happened in that Fifth Avenue store, carefully, factually, enough detail to expose the behavior without exaggeration. Peaton was no longer just a wealthy developer. He became a headline, a symbol of a kind of racism New York was pretending it had moved past. And once the media shines a light, there's no way to control where it spreads. That light reached civil rights organizers. Groups like CORE and NAACP didn't need to be convinced this mattered. They had been waiting for moments like this. Clear examples, public proof, targets that represented more than one man. Peaceful protests formed, flyers were printed, sidewalks filled, all legal, all disciplined, all impossible to ignore. What made this war invisible was that none of it broke the law. No violence, no threats, no crimes, just consequences, economic pressure, public accountability, social isolation. The system Peaton had benefited from his entire life was now turning against him, using its own rules. Bumpy didn't touch the man. He touched everything the man depended on, and by the time 72 hours passed, the damage was already permanent. By the third day, everything started falling at once, not gradually, not in stages, but like a floor disappearing beneath someone who thought they were standing on solid ground. Banks began calling loans, millions of dollars suddenly due. Agreements that had protected Peaton for years were now being enforced to the letter. No favors, no extensions, just deadlines he couldn't meet. Outside his buildings, protesters gathered daily, calm, organized, visible. Signs carried his name. Flyers told his story. Tenants watched from windows. Potential renters turned away. Every demonstration chipped away at the image of stability he depended on to keep his empire intact. Inside those same buildings, tenants found courage in numbers. Meetings were held, complaints were filed. Rent was withheld, not stolen, not hidden, placed into escrow, legal, protected, and devastating. Cash flow slowed. Maintenance issues multiplied. Lawyers were hired, and for the first time, Peaton wasn't dictating the terms. Then came the silence. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. Men who once shared his table suddenly had other plans, other priorities, other friends. In Manhattan society, exile doesn't come with an announcement. It comes with absence. And absence can destroy a man faster than any public scandal. Peyton didn't understand how it was happening. He made frantic calls, demanded explanations, asked who was behind it. Some mentioned the store, some mentioned the protests, but no one gave him a name, no enemy to confront, no single hand to fight. Just a tightening circle closing in from every direction. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just removes the floor, and Peyton was in free fall. By the third day, everything began to fall at once. Not slowly, not in pieces, but all together. Like a floor vanishing beneath a man who never imagined he could fall. Banks started calling loans. Millions of dollars suddenly due. Contracts that once protected him were now enforced without mercy. No grace period, no favors, just hard deadlines he couldn't meet. Outside his buildings, protesters appeared day after day. Calm, organized, disciplined. His name written clearly on signs, his actions explained on flyers. Tenants watched from their windows. Potential renters crossed the street. Every protest chipped away at the illusion of control he depended on to survive. Inside those same buildings, tenants found strength in numbers. Meetings were held, complaints filed, rent withheld legally and placed into escrow, not stolen, not hidden, protected by law. Cash flow slowed to a crawl. Repairs piled up, lawyers flooded in, and for the first time in his life, Peyton wasn't giving orders. He was reacting. Then came the silence. Phones stopped ringing. Invitations disappeared. Men who once praised him suddenly became unavailable. In Manhattan society, exile isn't loud. It doesn't need headlines. It happens quietly, through absence, and absence can ruin a man faster than scandal ever could. Peyton was confused, panicked. He demanded answers, made call after call, trying to figure out who was doing this to him. Some mentioned the store incident, some mentioned protests, but no one gave him a name, no single enemy, no clear target, just pressure from every direction at once. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just removes the floor, and Charles Whitfield Peyton III was already falling. By Wednesday afternoon, the chaos finally took a human shape. A lawyer walked into Peyton's office, calm, well-dressed, unhurried. While Peyton sat surrounded by papers, unpaid notices, and ringing phones that no longer brought solutions, the lawyer didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't accuse. He simply said he was there to explain why everything was happening at once. He spoke plainly about the incident in the Fifth Avenue store, about the two women who were humiliated, about how public racism had consequences in October 1964. Peyton tried to interrupt, tried to deny, tried to explain himself. But the lawyer didn't engage in debate. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to inform. Then the truth was delivered. Slowly, deliberately. The women Peyton had screamed at weren't strangers. They were the wife and daughter of Bumpy Johnson. And what Peyton was experiencing wasn't bad luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was response, measured, legal, complete. Peyton asked what he could do to stop it. An apology, a statement, a donation, something. Anything. The lawyer shook his head. There would be no negotiation, no meeting, no forgiveness tour. The lesson had already been taught. The damage was already done. And before leaving, the lawyer delivered the final message, quiet, cold, unemotional. You were lucky he chose business instead of blood. The door closed, and Peyton was left alone, finally understanding that the man he insulted by proxy never needed to raise a hand. Because real power didn't need to threaten, it simply acted. 1 week later, on the same Fifth Avenue sidewalk, May and Ruthie Johnson returned to the store where they had been humiliated. This time the doors opened before they reached them. The manager stepped forward personally, his voice careful, apologetic. He acknowledged what had happened, not defensively, not vaguely, but directly, assuring them it would never happen again, that the man responsible was no longer welcome, that every customer would be treated with respect going forward. Inside, everything felt different. Sales clerks approached immediately, attentive, professional, almost reverent. Other shoppers noticed. Some recognized the women from the week before. Some understood exactly why this moment mattered. Quiet nods, soft smiles. Small gestures of solidarity replaced the silence that once filled the room. No stares, no tension, just normalcy. The kind that should have existed all along. When May and Ruthie finally walked back out onto Fifth Avenue, shopping bags in hand, the moment lingered because it wasn't just about clothes, it was about dignity restored. about a line that had been crossed and then answered. In October 1964, one man learned the hard way that insulting the wrong family in Harlem could cost you everything.